I blame my school, really. It was a proud, ancient city school in Edinburgh with a rigorous Scottish tradition. So I did Latin, Greek, French, history and maths among my school-leaving subjects. But they had never sent anybody to university in England, including Oxford or Cambridge. So I ended up studying the wrong subject. I was a social scientist at heart, stuck in a history major. As a grad student and postdoc, I picked up more contemporary social science. In the mid-1980s, when I had time off to study applications of public choice in political science, my economics colleague David Soskis put me in the freshman economics class. It all seemed hopeless until my school calculus came back to me. Then economics, or at least micro, suddenly became comprehensible. Nevertheless, as a relative latecomer to formal political science, I was clear that I would never be able to prove theorems. I could understand them at the level required in those days to teach public choice and social choice to smart students, some of whom have seriously outsmarted me, who can indeed prove new theorems. At that stage I was regularly teaching from Duncan Black's Theory of Committees and Elections, and becoming intrigued by Black's discussion of the French classics, Condorcet and Borda, and particularly by his detective work on Lewis Carroll, C.L. Dodgson, who worked less than half a mile from my office, less than half a mile indeed from my present office. Already I spotted a common theme of the lonely, misunderstood scholar such as Condorcet, Lewis Carroll and Duncan Black. The fact that Black was a fellow Scot who had struggled for recognition until late in life made another bond of sympathy. My work got 3 lucky breaks, 1 from Kenneth Arrow and 2 from Bill Riker. When I first met Arrow, very nervously, in Stanford in 1987, we started talking about the history of social choice, and Arrow opined that Dodgson might have drawn his understanding of social choice from Todhunter's History of Probability. Well, it happened that I had read that, following Black's cue, and could corroborate that Todhunter so spectacularly fails to get to first base in understanding Condorcet that Dodgson could not have got his ideas from there. This meeting helped persuade me that there was an academic niche, not in proving theorems, but in understanding how and when theorems came to be proved, and why, in our field, they were repeatedly forgotten. Riker visited Oxford twice in the last decade of his life. He showed me 2 papers, one a draft of his little social choice and welfare paper on Luther Martin, which I won't discuss now, but everybody should read. The second, after he had returned to Rochester, was a photocopy from Paul E. Sigmund's book on Nicholas of Cusa, also known as Cusanus, in which Sigmund mentions, but does not discuss, Cusanus's proposed voting scheme for electing a Holy Roman Emperor. Bill's note to me said, "A medieval Borda scheme for you." And so it is. It forms chapter 4 of Classics of Social Choice. I got 2 research grants. One was to conserve and catalogue the papers of Duncan Black, the other to translate sections of Condorcet's essay. In France, interest in Condorcet was rising sharply as the bicentenary of the Revolution approached in 1989. Condorcet had always been known as the tragic author of the Esquisse d'un tableau historique des progrès de l'esprit humain, a paean to the future of enlightened humanity, written under the sentence of death in the Terror of 1794. The social choice side of Condorcet's work was disconnected, despite the pioneering efforts of Black, Keith Baker, and a number of French scholars. In 1988, the connection was being made by a group of French CNRS researchers working on the Condorcet manuscripts at the Institut de France, and notably by an important biography of Condorcet by the husband and wife team of Elisabeth and Robert Badinter, she a distinguished historian, he Minister of Justice in the Socialist government of France. Into this environment, a number of Anglophone scholars stepped, to give papers at the 1988 Colloque Condorcet in Paris. There, Arnie Erkin and I met for the first time. Having discovered that we both held grants to translate Condorcet, we decided to split the work and pool the efforts. I chose the easier task, to scrutinize the less technical publications of Condorcet for any text that would illuminate the notoriously obscure essay of 1785. Arnie and his colleagues would ascend Everest and tackle the essay itself. There also, in the Institut de France, my 8-month-old daughter dropped a canapé on the august floor, where Condorcet had lived and worked, but probably had not had to watch out for spilt canapés. Still on the subject of food, but spoiling the timeline, the frozen yogurt of my title was bought by Arnie and me for Colin Day of Michigan Press at a Public Choice Society meeting in Tucson in the early 1990s, when we pitched what was to become Classics of Social Choice to him. It was a good investment. Michigan Press accepted our prospectus, and the book was published in 1995, 20 years ago this year. It remains my, and I would imagine Arnie's, most cited work. I'm now going to talk about the texts that my team translated. Of the 14 chapters, 3 are reprints of English work by Dodson and Nansen. Of the remaining texts, 3 were originally written in Latin, 1 in Catalan, 1 in Spanish, and the rest in French. While Arnie's team at Stevens Tech were climbing Everest, the Oxford team had to assemble the expertise to tackle technical texts, one of them 2,000 years old, the newest 200 years old, in 4 languages. Oxford, with very strong faculties of languages and philosophy, was an excellent place to assemble the teams who are named and credited in the prelims to our book. While I did not draft any of the translations myself, I had to have enough grasp of the languages to skim the texts, select the passages of greatest relevance, and then review the draft translations, especially for their handling of technical terms. After many years, my highly conservative school education had come into its own. I discovered a particular fluency in Ramon Llull's 13th century Catalan language, which I taught myself by triangulating Latin and French, with a little holiday Spanish thrown in. Turning to the individual texts, Pliny was easy. His letter to Titius Aristo of AD 105 approx was already known from the work of Farquharson and Riker. We took the standard translation by Betty Radice, tweaked it slightly after reviewing the technical terms from the standard edition of the original letters in Latin. Ramon Llull was a voyage of discovery, not complete at the time when we published Classics. Following Bill Riker's tip about Cusanus, we were led back to the standard edition in Latin of his works. There we found, from footnotes, that he had probably transcribed a unique copy of a manuscript by Ramon Llull, 200 years earlier, De Arte Electionis, on the art of elections. We reviewed such scholarly literature as existed, there wasn't much, on Llull's possible influence on Cusanus. This led us in turn to Llull's Catalan text, which is a chapter of a didactic novel written in 1283, on the exemplary life of the hermit Blanquerna, who becomes the Pope, but renounces everything to become a hermit again, something the real Pope Celestine V was to do in 1294. The novel came first, so life imitated art in this case. We came to regard Llull as a good friend, whose mad enthusiasms had masked for 7 centuries the first mathematician to propose matrix notation for exhaustive pairwise comparison. The Llull story was completed, as far as we know, by the more recent discovery by Friedrich Quicklesheim in Augsburg of a third text, which shows that Llull's procedure is a precursor of Copeland, rather than, as we speculate in Classics, of Borda. Plunging into the French Golden Age, we first provided a new translation of Borda's paper, marvelling at its clarity and simplicity. Recently, Borda has been rather in Condorcet's shadow, as Condorcet's hostility to him, which we documented, became better known. The paper, and what we have labelled as Borda's equivalence theorem, viz. that the Borda score is simultaneously the average grade of each candidate and the total number of pairwise victories that he has scored, should be better known. Our most prized Condorcet discovery was the extract from his Essay on Provincial Assemblies, which forms Chapter 7 of Classics. With typical ill luck, Condorcet had laboured long and hard on a Condorcetian electoral system for a network of provincial assemblies that Louis XVI had decided to call at the start of the Revolution. Before Condorcet's text was even published, the king changed his mind. As far as we know, nobody before us had noticed that this ignored essay contains a much clearer statement of an independence of irrelevant alternatives axiom than does the notoriously obscure essay of 1785. When we showed it in draft to Professor Arrow, he expressed gracious dismay at having been scooped by almost 200 years, although he went on to point out quite correctly that Condorcet does not formalize his IIA axiom. Nevertheless, the Provincial Assembly's essay is one of the clearest documents to show exactly what is at stake between the Borda rule and any Condorcet efficient rule. By following cues and leads from Duncan Black, we discovered that Condorcet's essay was understood by at least 4 people, perhaps by exactly 4 people. We do not repeat Black's discussion of Laplace, which stands on its own. But we located texts by L'Huillier, Morales, and Donu, which form chapters 9 to 11 of our book. Of these, L'Huillier stands out. He was a Genevan mathematician. Using elementary but exhaustive math, he shows that one of Condorcet's pet schemes was found not to be Condorcet efficient when tried in Geneva. Indeed, it seems to have led to chaos. Donu reveals the checkered history of elections of academicians to the French Academy of Sciences in the 30 years following the essay. He confirms that Borda's scheme was found to be manipulable and that Napoleon had it abolished, and proposes a better scheme for that purpose, electing of academicians, which unfortunately the Academy did not adopt. In conclusion, I would like to thank the Public Choice Society, where this book had its origin, in generously offering a panel to celebrate its 20th anniversary. And I take this opportunity to thank both Arnie and his team, and my Oxford colleagues, for the work they did all these years ago. We hope that we have rescued the reputation of some misunderstood geniuses. Thank you for listening.